Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion with Ambassador Mike McFaul. I am Jim Hake, the founder and CEO at Spirit of America, and I'm very, very happy to see so many of our supporters on the call today, including members of our board. And I want to thank all of you, but especially those who have been close to us over the years, for letting us speak with you today and talk about some of the most important issues in the world today with Ambassador McFaul. As background for everyone, Spirit of America is a privately funded 501c3 nonprofit. This year is our 20th anniversary. So for 20 years, we've worked alongside U.S. troops and diplomats all over the world to provide private assistance that helps them defend freedom, strengthen the front lines of democracy, and represent the best of who Americans are and what we stand for. So you can think about it as we provide private assistance to fill the gaps between what is needed and what government can do. And we're the only organization that has an agreement with the Department of Defense that allows the military, U.S. military, to work with us to identify needs, receive and distribute assistance, and provide logistical support. So right now, the Spirit of America team is active in Taiwan, West Africa, and the Middle East, and of course, Ukraine, which is what we're talking about today. And we've been active in Ukraine, helping Ukraine defend its freedom since 2014. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, since that began, our focus has been providing non-lethal assistance to help Ukraine soldiers. And our goal is to save lives and stop the suffering at its source by helping Ukraine win. To that end, we've raised $70 million, thanks to the support of many of the folks who are on our call today, and provided a wide range of non-lethal assistance. And all that is based on needs identified by U.S. military as well. So with that background, it is my great, great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mike McFaul. Ambassador McFaul served as U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. Currently, I believe he's at his office where he is the director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. And he also serves on Spirit of America's advisory board. So Ambassador McFaul, thank you for being part of the Spirit of America team, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's dive in. If you could give your view on why Putin started this war in 2022.
Well, I could burn up all of our time on that question. That's a big, hard one, but it's an important one. But before I get to that, I just want to say thank you, Jim, to everybody and to what you're doing in Ukraine. I work a lot in Ukraine. I speak to Ukrainians every single day over the last 2 years. And this is a tough time for Ukrainians, given especially the debates going on in our US Congress right now. It's a kind of a desperate time. People are depressed. They feel like we are abandoning them in the West. And that's almost a direct quote from a very, very senior person in Ukraine, just last week was told to me. You are not, and your team are not. So I just want to say thank you for that. To answer the question, which will be an echo of why I think it's of such consequence. You know, there are theories out there that this was a way to, Putin wanted to stop NATO expansion, that this was some kind of, you know, small incident, and if it could just have been resolved through negotiation, it could all have been avoided. I disagree with that analysis. I think fundamentally, Putin decided to invade Ukraine for two main reasons. One, he has an argument back home inside Russia about why Russia has to reject Western values, decadent, liberal values from the West, because those are not part of Russian culture and tradition. With that narrative goes a line of argumentation that Russians, they like a strong hand, they like a strong state. These are code words for autocracy, right? People call him a czar. He's not offended by that phrase anymore. He was, by the way, 20 years ago. His ideas have evolved, but this is his idea that justifies his dictatorship at home. It's based on these cultural, historical kind of arguments. The second argument he makes is that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. the country should not exist. It's a fabrication of, by the way, of both the Bolsheviks and the West. They blame both of them, interestingly, but that this was taken away from them, right? From the Russian Empire. It divided the Slavic nation. If you put those two arguments together, he has a problem in that Slavs, Ukrainians, practicing democracy undermine his legitimacy back home. And that's his problem. His problem has been with the expansion of democracy to Ukraine, not the expansion of NATO. And I think that's the central animating feature of this war. And by the way, I would date this war first and foremost to 2014. But really, I think you got to go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004, where through non-kinetic means, non-military means, he tried to undermine democratic ideas and democratic institutions in Ukraine, first and foremost. The second piece, it's related, but it's a newer version. It's something, that doesn't go back as far as 2004. But this is a war to reunite the Slavs, like I said, right? And these are his words, by the way. You don't have to be a criminologist. You don't have to be a mind reader. These are things he said in a very lengthy July 2021 piece. And then on the eve of this invasion, he did a 70-minute television speech. Maybe I was the only one that listened to the end, but I did listen to the end. And he was, on this part, he was very explicit. He's like, we are going to reunite the Slavic nation. To do so, we have to, these are his words, not mine, denazify Ukraine. To do so, we have to demilitarize Ukraine. And that is also part of his military objectives, which, by the way, he just reinforced and doubled down on just a few weeks ago. So he hasn't changed that, that objective. Now, when things went so poorly for him, and they really did in 2022, I see a kind of adjustment of his ambitious objectives. And he's added to those objectives just to hold the territories that he has conquered. And again, he just literally said that I want to say 2 or 3 days ago. And that is, he hasn't conquered those territories yet, by the way, let's be clear about that. But the 4 regions of Eastern Ukraine that he, in a big ceremony last year, declared on paper were parts of the Russian Federation. He'd already done that with Crimea, of course. I think his minimalist objective now is at least to capture those territories. By the way, in Russian maps that are made in Russia today, those territories, those regions are already part of the Russian Federation.
And you've done by the way, for everyone tuning in here, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar. We'll do our best to get them. We have a couple in there already, which I'll get to in a second. Mr. Ambassador, you've done a great 8-minute video on why Americans should care about Ukraine. And if you could pick 2 or 3 of the reasons why you think Americans should care, that you feel resonate best when you're talking to different audiences, if you could hit on that, why should Americans care about Ukraine?
Well, I would put it in 2 big buckets. I actually think America is a moral country. These people disagree with me, but I do a lot of talks on Ukraine all over the country. And by the way, not just in California and the East Coast, but places like Montana and Texas. And when I make those arguments, those are the ones, Jim, that resonate most with Americans. That there is good and evil in the world, and we're on the side of good. This is an evil war. Putin has already been indicted for crimes against humanity. We want to be against that. We want to be against the killing of innocent civilians, rape, torture, kidnapping. That's part of it. We are a country that defends democracy. This is a war between democracy and autocracy. We want to be against annexation because we've been down that road before. We know what happens when we allow countries to do that. So I think there's just some very powerful moral arguments why we need to help the Ukrainians. But secondly, if you don't care about that, And maybe some people don't. They just say, well, why should I care? America first. There's a prominent politician that uses that phrase a lot. I think this is a vital national security interest for the United States for the following reasons. If Putin loses in Ukraine, our allies in Europe will feel more secure. 3 days ago, I was in Lithuania with one of our NATO allies. There were several leaders from the region who are NATO allies. And I can tell you that they're very focused on this issue, because if Putin loses, they will feel more secure. If Putin wins, they feel more threatened. And let me just report from Lithuania, they feel really threatened now. The idea that Putin is going to stop in Ukraine is not one that senior Lithuanian officials talk about. They talk about the phrases that he hears from Putin and his government people, that they want to recreate the Russian Empire. And go back and look up the territories of the Russian Empire. It includes lots of countries today that are NATO allies. So this has a direct implication for our security interests vis-a-vis NATO. And God forbid, if he does achieve his objectives in Ukraine, we will have to spend more money defending our NATO allies, and we'll have to send more American troops to serve as tripwires to those frontline states. They're there now. We'll have to spend more and do more to deter Russia there. Second, I think it has implications in Asia. If Putin loses in Ukraine, I think that will cause Xi Jinping to think a little harder about using force vis-a-vis Taiwan. And there, I think it's part the military, but I also think it's part the sanctions regime, that he has to understand there are costs to using unprovoked military intervention if Putin loses. And remember, Putin, Russia and Iran and China and North Korea and Hezbollah and Hamas, they are all aligned today all over the world. And therefore, a loss for one of them is a loss for that coalition, that partnership. Conversely, if Putin wins in Ukraine, I think that emboldens Xi Jinping. They're all watching to see if we hang in there or not. And if we pull out after a couple of years and say it's not my problem, Xi Jinping will look at that and say, aha, all I have to do is hold out, and eventually the Americans will get tired and go away, and I'll achieve my objectives in Taiwan. And then finally, this bigger issue, I would say, and it's more amorphous, but the whole world is watching this war, right? And look at public opinion polls. And if Putin wins, the bench, those on the sidelines, right? Countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, they're going to lean just a little bit more towards the autocrats. And they're going to say, the theory that America is in decline, that the West is in decline, this is a very prominent argument that you hear around the world. At least I do when I travel. They're going to say, okay, here's more evidence of it, that the American era, the liberal era, the democratic era is over. Conversely, if Putin loses, that will be momentum for our side, and they're going to lean a little bit more towards us. So I think both for moral reasons and security reasons, the stakes here are pretty high.
Yeah, that's a great rundown. Thank you. And on the first point with the moral reasons, so what you're saying is that at least in some places, the notion of an aspirational America and who we are and what we stand for still resonates pretty well. Is that what you're saying?
It does. And, again, just because it's fresh on my mind, I was just in Lithuania with leaders from countries around there, but I also met with oppositions from Russia and Belarus that are based there. Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, the head of the Belarusian opposition, and small d Democrats like that. Without us, they're doomed. That's the strong message I got, both from our allies, but also from aspiring Democrats trying to take on autocracies. So to me, that is an essential role that the United States needs to play in the world. And, some people say it's not our problem, far away. That is a very dangerous way of thinking. That reminds me a lot of the 1930s. That was a time when that was the argument that was made. That's where the phrase America first comes from. The Italians went into Ethiopia and was like, well, that's not our problem. It's far away. Why do we care? Then Hitler started taking territory through measures of appeasement. In part, countries were doing appeasement because they got mixed signals from us. They couldn't rely on us. And so they had to think, well, if the Americans aren't going to be here, we got to cut deals. And we said, well, that's not our problem. Japanese went into China during that period, far away, and people like, well, that's not our problem. That's somebody else's fight. 1939 happened, and the Nazi Germany and the Soviets, both went into Poland, and we still stuck our head in the sand, saying it's not our problem. Who cares about democracies, autocracies, and these are wars of European wars that don't affect us. And then tragically, 1941, we were attacked and we got into the fight. But the historians, I'm not a historian of that period, but I read them frequently, they say, had we got more involved and tried to deter Nazi Germany years before, tried to deter the Japanese years before, maybe we could have avoided that catastrophic war, World War II. And I think that is a very important lesson. We may not think it's our problem now, but it could easily become our problem later.
Yeah, history would indicate that aggressors don't stop unless they're stopped.
Exactly.
And it's what you're saying. Thank you. So we have a number of questions here from folks, two related ones regarding support from the United States. Will Congress approve more aid for Ukraine? And can Ukraine survive without?
So let me take the second one first. They can survive, but not very easily. And without our assistance, a lot of Ukrainians are going to die. That's just a fact. They're already dying. They're already having to, save their ammunition, wait and see. It's definitely affecting already the way they're conducting the war. But without our assistance, many, many more Ukrainians will die. Civilians will die, because one of the things as President Zelensky just said recently, the number one thing they need right now is more interceptors for the Patriot systems and others that are running out. So without our assistance, Ukrainian civilians will die. And without our assistance, Ukrainian soldiers sitting in their trenches right now, waiting for better and more ammunition, will die. That's on us, as far as I'm concerned. And I think we need to look straight and say, okay, we're going to accept that cost. That's not one I want to accept, but that is the brutal reality of already, I would say, delays in this assistance. And by the way, I'm going to get to the first one in a minute, but I already think there has been collateral damage done to America's reputation in the world, that we have been debating this aid package now for over 4 months. And I heard it loud and clear in Lithuania, where it's like people can't understand. I explained, and I'm going to get to that in a moment, why it was taking so long. And it does not resonate for people on the front lines worrying about the Russians coming up to their borders. So that's on the second question. And the first question, I'm not an expert on American domestic politics. I don't want to pretend to be one. Obviously, I'm engaged in this debate, and whenever I can, including right now, as I'm going to do, I want to make the case for why we need to get this done as fast as possible. I think there's a good news, a bad news piece here. The good news is that in the reading of my, both support in the Senate and the House, there's still strong majorities in both that support aid to Ukraine. The last vote on the House floor was in October, and it was an amendment to end aid to Ukraine. I can't, this was still in the McCarthy era. The vote, that amendment was voted down. I'm just doing this off the top of my head, 300 to 100. And I got a text from a member of Congress who was on the floor that day, and she said, Mike, this is the good news. We still have the solid majority. Now, 100 is a big number, right? It was 50 just 6 months ago, but still, that's an overwhelming majority. And let's just remind ourselves, in the US House of Representatives these days, there are not very many votes that have such majorities. That's the good news. I don't think anything on that front has changed. The bad news is that, in part because it was the Biden strategy, this vote on this has now gotten entangled into immigration reform, security of the border, whatever phrase you want to use to describe that. And, I think in retrospect, that was probably not a good idea. I think, we should have gone with what some Republicans were saying, that we should have straight up votes on different issues so that the American people know that what we're voting on. I'm paraphrasing some of the folks that brought down Speaker McCarthy, and one of their beefs was we have to have these clean votes. They don't seem so animated by that argument anymore, by the way, but I remember it. But because I was entangled, and we just heard from, there was a meeting yesterday at the White House, and the readouts of that were not very promising. This has been tied up into the Republicans trying to leverage what they call necessary reforms to secure our border as linkage, as a quid pro quo for assistance to Ukraine. And I just think this is shameful. I want to be clear. It's one thing to do trades on things that I'm giving this to you, in return you give this to me, right? That's called log rolling. I don't think it's a great way to legislate, but it's a tradition in our history. But what's so bizarre about this is that those blocking aid to Ukraine actually support providing that aid to Ukraine. They actually understand, at least to my knowledge, when I interact with them, that this is in America's national interest. So I just think we have to get this done. Again, I don't know what the strategy will be. Maybe the Senate will vote first and compel on the House side, but I think it's doing real damage to the war effort in Ukraine. That's what my Ukrainian colleagues tell me. And it's also doing real damage to our reputation in the world more broadly. There is a sense out there, Jim, that we've just lost our way, that we are incapable of unifying and acting together in ways that we ourselves define are in our own national security interests. And I think we've got to end that, and at least getting this vote through might send a signal that those crazy days of hurting ourselves because of our polarized politics might be over.
Well, we certainly hope so. And let's assume that, and we don't know if it's a great assumption or not, of course. Let's assume that U.S. support for Ukraine does continue. If that's the case, how does this end? What does a positive outcome look like in your view?
I don't know. And I don't trust anybody who says that they do know. When I listen to what Mr. Putin's saying, I hear nothing in anything he said to suggest that he wants to negotiate, that he wants to withdraw. There was some reporting a few weeks ago about intermediaries and emissaries saying he wanted to negotiate. Those were all unnamed sources. That sounds like a bunch of think tankers to me that have no authority with Putin. I see nothing on his side, just the opposite. He thinks time's on his side. Who is most joyful about these delays in assistance? Watch Russian TV. His propagandists are on every night celebrating this, talking about how great this is. And second, they're waiting for Mr. Trump. Now, whether that is the right assumption about Mr. Trump or not, I'm not an expert. I think, this idea that he's going to come and help Putin, maybe not. But I can tell you without question, that is the hope in Moscow. And so until that moment, there's no way that Putin will negotiate. And on the Ukrainian side, they've had a tough year. I think in retrospect, it was wrong for all of us. And I think we in the West are most to blame to put all this pressure on this one counteroffensive. As I like to say, I would want us just to stop using that phrase and stop compelling anybody to talk about it ahead of time. Like, why, first of all, most wars, I'm not an expert on wars, but I teach about them, have many counteroffensives, not one. Two, you don't generally tell the world that you're going to run a counteroffensive before you do. And I just think the way we framed that all was a giant mistake. It created expectations that couldn't be met. Next to not giving them the weapon systems to actually do the things that we wanted them to do in that counteroffensive. Having said all that, my sense of the Ukrainians is that they still want to liberate their country, and they still think they have the means to do so. if we are there with them. So, I guess I don't see, as long as we are there with them, I tragically don't see this ending anytime soon. And if I were thinking about breakthrough moments, I would be looking more towards the spring of 2025 than the spring of 2024.
Well, along the lines of leaning forward or not in supporting Ukraine, I'd like to get your advice for us at Spirit of America. And with the uncertainty in U.S. support through Congress, as we were just talking about, should we as an organization and our supporters, sit back, wait and see what happens, or would your advice be for us to the maximum extent possible, lean forward and still help Ukraine? If you could weigh in on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, of course you should weigh in. I mean, continue to do the things you do independently. But I was just talking to a staffer in the House just a couple of days ago, and paraphrasing, and this is a private conversation, but somebody intimately involved in this stuff. He or she, I'll even make it more ambiguous, said there's two moods on Capitol Hill that need to be changed. One is that this is not urgent, and there's a sense that they're voting on a lot of things, and there's a theory running around that this is not urgent. And so for those who are working with Ukrainians who can give witness that it is, members of Congress need to hear that from you. And second, they need to hear that the American people care about this. And I think we grossly, as American citizens, underestimate, especially the causal impact, to use a social science term, of reaching out to your representatives to express your opinion. I've seen it 100 times. When I was ambassador, for instance, Putin cut off adoptions for Americans of Russian kids. It was a horrible thing he did. It was in reaction to something called the Magnitsky Act. And we were doing what we had to do. We had our response, the administration. But when members of Congress, because they heard from constituents, started calling the Secretary of State, started calling the Chief of Staff, I can tell you it had a real wake-up call. It put fire under our feet because the U.S. Congress has that capability. So I would just tell people, take the time to find out where your representative is and communicate to them so that they know that their constituents care. I think it has a much bigger impact on their calculations than people think about, especially in election years, as we are in as of a couple of weeks ago.
Ambassador, it's a great point, and it reminds me of this was about 6 years ago, and I was speaking with a staffer for a congressperson, I forget who, and it doesn't matter. And they were talking about some issue, and I again forget what that issue was, but they said, yeah, we had a crazy response from our constituents on this issue. People were calling in and so forth. And I said, well, how many people called? And it was something like 25.
Exactly.
And it was a remarkably small number. I thought it would be thousands, and it was a tiny number. So with that, there are a number of questions with everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to, but we're at time. Ambassador McFaul, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. Wonderful to hear from you. And thank you for being part of the Spirit of America team again. And for everyone on the call, if, as we were talking about, if you are interested in saving lives and helping Ukraine defend its freedom and its people and its democracy, please join with us at Spirit of America or at spiritofamerica.org. And we welcome you being part of the team. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you again.
Thanks, Jim, for having me.